And as you can see here, the blue is people have a strategy. So the vast majority, even in the industry that's furthest ahead, which is electronics and high tech, still has over 59% of no strategy. So a long ways for a lot of companies to go.
And again, part of your strategy is also, especially in view of the final rule, is asking yourself, who will file Form SD? And the reason this is important is because in the proposed rule, it is very clear that this was part of 10K, so the CFO, the controller was on the hook for it. But now with the final rule saying it has to be an officer of the company, it's left the door open. And typically, I mean, conflict minerals is the hot potato, right? I mean, if you have a choice, as an officer in the company, why would you put your name to it? Especially in the first few years, the answer is going to be, I don't know. So we encourage companies to think about who will who will sign Form SD. And the reason this is important is because that person has to be on board with your strategy. You say that, okay, first 2 years, my conclusion is going to be this. This is the extent of my exposure. This is my scope. This are my goals of my program. Whoever is going to sign Form SD has to be on board and say, yeah, I agree with that, and I'll sign Form SD if we meet these requirements.
It's important because that person or that group ultimately will own conflict minerals going forward in a business as usual environment. And to Vala's point, they're going to direct all efforts as to what needs to be collected as their name is on a file document. We've seen it all over the place, from CEO to CFO to someone in sustainability. It needs to be an officer of the company. That's all that was said in the final rule. We suspect, based on the companies we've been working with, it's somebody in SEC reporting will sign because they already own the relationship with the Securities and Exchange Commission with respect to the 10K filings and Q filings and so on. But I don't think a lot of folks have thought about ultimately where you want to be, and we suggest as part of your strategy or philosophy, that's something perhaps you should consider.
Amy, anything to add from the
Yeah,
legal
the only
side?
thing I would add there is that, the rules say it needs to be an executive officer. And when we were first talking about this and people were saying that the CFO is concerned about signing the form itself, that puzzles me a little bit because the CEO will be, while they're not required to certify anything in the Form SD, the CEO and all the periodic reports will be, the CEO and CFO, certified to the disclosure controls and procedures at the company. So the CFO needs to have confidence that the procedures are in place so that they can say that the disclosure controls and procedures are effective when they do, the Qs and the Ks.
Any questions from the crowd? Not at this time.
And then, I mean, beyond that, one step ahead is once you get to the audit, there's also the question of, socializing this with the audit committee. And then, and this is where, we strongly advise our clients that as you start to develop your program around it, one good idea may be to include your current auditor, bring them on and say, hey, this is what we are working towards. Is this something that you will agree with? I mean, you don't want to go through the entire process come end of the year, and then you decide, yeah, I'm going to get my auditor to audit my conflict minerals report, and they say, wait a minute, I don't agree with your steps that you went through, right? Since there's a lot of room for interpretation here, once you developed your process, we encourage you to work with your auditor and say, yeah, this is my process. Do you think it's reasonable? Will you be willing to sign my audit report if need be based on this process?
As my audit clients would say to me, we want you to do real-time auditing. Just as we go through the process, we want you one step behind us just to be sure what we're doing makes sense and we can get through it. The timeline for complying with this, it starts January 1st, 13. It's not that far away. And perhaps having your auditor on board as you develop your strategy and your different phases might be a smart way of going through where you don't get to the end of the year and they disagree with steps 2 and 3 that you took.
Yeah, I was curious when I saw this slide what the other 31% was. It seemed like a yes/no kind of question. Does your audit committee know, and have you talked to your board? And 31% didn't know if they had done either, I guess.
Yeah, I think they don't know, but I think that, I'm
Yep.
sorry.
Oh, we got somebody.
Well, I think, I understand that because I can see how, if it's coming out through the legal side, that the corporate governance committee of a board could have been briefed, or the board could have been briefed, and the person who received the survey, who would have been on the audit side, might have no visibility to that. So there may have been more done that the people just weren't aware of because they wouldn't get the board minutes.
Yeah, no, it's a great point, and that, I think that highlights that many companies are coming at this from different points on the spear, right? Is legal driving it? Is procurement driving it? Is sustainability driving it? Is the CFO driving it?
Audit, is there a requirement that your external auditors also conduct the audit and issue the report for conflict minerals?
The question is there a requirement that your external financial statement auditors are required to do the audit of your conflict minerals report? Is that correct? There is no requirement that you have to use your external financial statement audits. It gets back down to performance audits versus due diligence. If we're in a performance audit under generally accepted government auditing standards, any non-AICPA certified firm can do it. So you may not even need a Big Four or a smaller firm. You could go to these boutique firms that are being created specifically as a result of conflict minerals. If it's a due diligence report under generally accepted government auditing standards, it has to be an AICPA certified firm that does the actual audit of the conflict minerals report. But there is no requirement that it has to be your financial statement auditor.
And the SEC did clarify too that if you used your existing auditor, that there wouldn't be an independence issue. But you do need to make sure that the fees that you pay are pre-approved, and then those would get disclosed as other fees in your proxy statement.
That's a real important question, because the question we always do get around independence: what independence are we under if we're your financial statement auditor and perhaps you want your financial statement auditor to help you in your due diligence? We believe right now that because it's a filed document with the SEC independence would come into place. But if you go down the path of engaging your financial statement auditor for the audit of your conflict minerals report, you also have government independence considerations that you need to factor in. So there could be multiple levels of independence when it comes to whether or not you choose to use your financial statement auditor in an advisory type capacity.
So Sasha, we're in the early periods of this, but have companies been publishing? You hinted a little while ago that some companies are starting to say some things, and why are they doing that?
Yeah, we're seeing a number of consumer electronics companies making statements either in their annual reports or their annual sustainability or corporate social responsibility reports, and I think they're doing it because they're hearing it from the people that buy their products. So, like I said, we're active on 130 campuses, and many of those campuses are passing resolutions to say we want to make sure that our university is purchasing only conflict-free electronics. And so, then all of a sudden the salesmen who come to the campus, get hit with this. Well, are you conflict-free or not? And, oh my God, I don't know. So you pass it back to the company. And
What do you
all
think
of a
that
sudden
salesman really said? Do you think they said they don't know? I'm a skeptic. I think they probably said, oh yeah, no conflict free.
Of course, of course. So how are you verifying it? Oh, well, okay. Let's write that down. So yeah, I mean, actually, one of the best reports was from Acer. If you look on their company website, they map out exactly who the smelters are, and they've got charts and so forth, and that's a very forward-leaning way of doing it, just being as transparent and open as possible.
And again, the cynic in me, are they doing it for competitive advantage, for greater sales, or are they great corporate citizens, or do they see it as a combination of the two?
Well, it's hard to tell the motivations, but I mean, we certainly get all kinds of inquiries from our constituents to say, we will only buy conflict-free products. So we think that there's a strong public interest.
Yeah, I would agree. I think it's a combination of the two. Obviously, companies, large multinationals, are concerned about their branding and being good corporate citizens. But at the same time, it's a new market. If they can get ahead of their competitors, it could be a marketing advantage that they're using. And there are a number of publicly traded companies that actually have conflict-free declarations on their website and their investor relations, as well as dealing with the California Supply Chain Transparency Act. And they're looking to get ahead and perhaps be deemed conflict-free for fiscal year or calendar year 13. You're starting to see that level of activity occur.
Tom, and then I'd like to add that, if your only issue is meeting SEC requirements, you can have an innovative set of lawyers in a company that will scope this so narrowly that you can come back and say, I'm going to interpret this in such a narrow way that I'm DRC conflict-free in year one. I mean, there's a lot of latitude in the law, but again, meeting the requirements of the law is not the only reason why companies are working on it. And I mean, and there will be, I mean, you have to look around in your peer group and see what other companies are doing on this, and then, decide what's the scope is. You can't do it in isolation. And that's where, your It's so important to see who are my stakeholders, what am I trying to appeal to, are customers watching this, am I, am I, putting myself up for, at the end of the day, this is a name and shame kind of legislation. Remember that. There is no penalty for you to say, yes, I'm using DRC conflict, prone material, right? I mean, so that's something to keep in mind that, this is a public perception issue, and you want to make sure that you are not harming your brand in any way.
And that's why I think doing it in an industry association group environment would be good to understand where you and your peers are going to go. If perhaps you narrowly define it, like Bal had indicated, and your peers were a bit more conservative in how they actually scoped it out, you're going to look a lot different. And perhaps now that it's a public document, many different types of constituents are going to be able to get that information and see how you compare to your peers.
Just one other point I'd add to that is I think there's an important distinction to be drawn between Congo-free or even Africa-free and conflict-free. I think the whole thinking behind this legislation was really to stop the whole practice of, kind of turning a blind eye, like, oh, well, we don't know where our products come from. That there's certain people in certain supply chains somewhere that were doing that. And so to basically turn that around and say, it's much more important to actually find out where these things come from. And there's no penalties if you say we funded the worst rebel group in the world. And you say, okay, fine, so you found that out. Now you'll make a smart business decision and probably switch. But there are plenty of conflict-free mines out in Congo and the region, and we're really encouraging companies to go and partner with other companies or our mining groups on the ground that can source from those. And just to give you one example, Motorola Solutions started a project out in eastern Congo to source from a mine through a closed-end pipeline. And so there are 4 different companies in this supply chain, and they're helping improve working conditions and labor standards in that area. In fact, they just released a video about it. And that's something we really strongly encourage, because that really contributes to the solution, cutting off the armed groups, but helping miners and communities on the ground too.
You mentioned earlier, Jim, that mining was excluded, and that has caused this one to pause a little bit. How did they come up with that? Because wouldn't that be even before the smelter?
I think it would be, and I think they're trying to get to the smelter level with the certifications of the smelters. But Section 1504 of Dodd-Frank would pick up all mining-type activities, extraction issuers, to the extent they would have to disclose anything greater than $100,000 for all projects around the world to actually dig stuff up. And you're going to see in various countries and projects what they're doing. It's part of Form SD. They're going to have to disclose that. I think where the SEC was coming was because they had that requirement under Dodd-Frank. If they were subject to 1502, it would be almost duplication of efforts.
Okay.
Now, that one's subject to a lawsuit as well.
Leading practices, Jim, I think you're going to tee this slide up for everyone?
Yep. What the number one question we get is, well, what does my project plan look like? Who should be involved? What are the steps that I need to go through? I think prior to the rule becoming finalized, it was mainly driven from procurement and supply chain. Anyone in the controller finance group didn't want anything to do with it because it was going to be a furnishment requirement at that point in time. Subsequent to the rule becoming finalized and it becoming a filing requirement, you're seeing a lot more activity from the controller's finance group. So what we've done across the top is laid out the 4 key steps, which is develop the strategy, identify usage exposure to the minerals, institutionalize the process in a business as usual environment, and report SEC disclosures. On the left-hand column, you're seeing the various functions that we think that need to be involved in year 1. Your procurement group, design, product manufacture, legal, sustainability, IT, controller finance, and internal audit. Now, I think what's also interesting is not only is this sort of a compliance requirement that you have, but new product development. Are you training your engineers as they develop new products, what potential future exposures could be? Any acquisitions that you're thinking of private companies outside the United States? How are you baking this in as part of your due diligence for determining what purchase price consideration should be based on potential exposure? So there's a lot of front office activities in addition to back office reporting type activities that companies probably need to think about, and bringing that out as part of your strategy and your philosophy in step 1 is probably what companies need to do. I think what we've tried to do is lay out where, at least in year one, we see these various functions playing a role. Every company will be slightly different depending on what functions that they have, and perhaps they might use internal audit more as management versus coming from behind and actually looking at what was done, depending on their exposure and their need. But it's more of a straw man that we tried to put together based on the companies that we've worked with over the last 18 months to 2 years as to what we think year one would look like, or at least institutionalizing this over the 2-year indeterminable period.
Amy, as you're seeing it out in the community, I mean, lots of people to get together, what is the key to a successful start?